The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the quiet park. The air was thick with the earthy scent of autumn, dry leaves scattered across the ground, carried by the occasional gust of wind that stirred the treetops. The park was alive with sounds. Children's laughter echoed across the playground, their voices rising and falling in playful shrieks. Parents chatted softly on the benches nearby, some glancing up to watch their children play, others lost in conversation, exchanging casual words about their day. But in the midst of all the noise, in the corner where the swings creaked and the slide's metallic surface glistened under the fading sunlight, there was a stark contrast. 8-year-old Ethan sat motionless in his wheelchair, his gaze fixed downward at the dry leaves that swirled in the wind. His thin hands rested on the chair's armrests, and his shoulders were hunched slightly, as though the weight of the world rested on them. His blue plaid jacket, too big for his frail body, hung loosely around him, the fabric barely able to mask the vulnerability in his posture. His once curious, light blue eyes, those eyes that had sparkled with wonder and joy, now reflected something darker, something close to resignation. The sounds around him felt muffled, as if they were coming from far away. The laughter of the children, the soft chatter of parents, it all blended into one indistinct hum. To Ethan, it was as though the world was moving on without him, and he was stuck in a moment he could never escape. Beside him, his parents watched with heavy hearts. Sarah, his mother, tried to put on a brave face, her lips curling into a small, reassuring smile as she spoke. "Ethan, look at the kids on the swing," she said softly. "You want to go over and watch them?" But her words hung in the air, unanswered, as Ethan merely turned the wheel of his chair, pushing it further away from the scene. His expression, hardened like stone, made it clear that he wasn't interested. His father, Michael, stood off to the side, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes fixed on his son. He didn't say anything. There was nothing he could say. He couldn't make Ethan feel better. The accident had taken something from their son, something that might never be returned. He swallowed hard, fighting back the lump in his throat. This wasn't the life they had planned for their boy. But what could they do? All they could do was watch as their son drifted farther away from them. It was then, just as the sun seemed to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the playground, that something unexpected broke the silence. A bark, loud and persistent. Everyone in the park turned toward the source of the sound. At first, it was just a noise, but it was the kind of noise that couldn't be ignored, a sound that seemed to cut through the ambient murmur of the park, drawing everyone's attention. And then they saw her, a golden retriever, her fur shining like molten gold in the fading sunlight, appeared from the edge of the park. She ran across the open space with a purpose, her movements determined and sure. People murmured in the background, recognizing her. "Maggie," someone whispered, but the dog didn't acknowledge the voice. She didn't stop to greet anyone. She kept running, straight toward Ethan. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Ethan, no," she said, her voice rising in panic. She rushed forward, as if to protect him from whatever was coming. Michael followed close behind, his eyes narrowing, his instincts telling him that something wasn't right. "Stay away from him," Michael shouted, his voice filled with a protective urgency. But Maggie didn't flinch. She didn't slow down. Instead, she stopped a mere few feet from Ethan and began to bark. Not out of aggression, not out of anger. Her barks were urgent, desperate, like she was trying to get someone's attention, someone who didn't know they were supposed to listen. The park around them seemed to fall away as the focus turned entirely to the dog and the boy in the chair. Sarah's heart raced as she reached Ethan, crouching beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes wide with confusion, his small body trembling slightly. "What does she want?" he whispered, his voice strained. The tension in the air was palpable. The dog's behavior was strange, unlike anything Sarah had ever seen before. And there was something in Maggie's eyes, something that felt almost human. It was like she knew something that no one else did, like she was trying to tell them something, but they couldn't hear it. As Ethan trembled in his chair, his eyes darting from the dog to his parents, a wave of uncertainty washed over him. He didn't understand why Maggie was acting like this. He didn't understand why she was staring at him with such intensity. But then, slowly, as if something inside him shifted, Ethan raised one trembling hand toward the dog. Everyone froze. It was like time itself had stopped. Maggie's eyes locked onto Ethan's, and for a moment, she stopped barking. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze never wavering. There was something there, something in her eyes that made Sarah's chest tighten. It was as if Maggie was trying to communicate, trying to share a message that no one else could hear. The silence stretched on. Ethan's hand hovered in the air, just inches from Maggie's head, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. But before he could touch the dog, Maggie let out a soft whimper, almost as if she was urging him to do something, to take that final step. And that's when everything changed. As Ethan slowly lowered his hand, the park around him felt like a distant memory. The sounds of the children playing, the rustling of the leaves in the wind, all of it seemed to fade away as he focused entirely on the golden retriever in front of him. Maggie's deep brown eyes seemed to pierce through him, her stare unwavering, filled with an emotion that was impossible to describe. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something else, something much more profound. Sarah, standing beside her son, watched the dog with a mix of confusion and concern. She could see the way Maggie's body tensed, her tail still as she stared at Ethan, and she couldn't help but feel an unsettling sense of urgency. The dog wasn't acting like a normal dog. This wasn't the playful, friendly animal that would chase after a stick or wag its tail at every passerby. Maggie's eyes held a quiet desperation that both confused and terrified Sarah. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "Are you okay?" Ethan didn't respond immediately. He was staring at the dog, his lips pressed together in concentration, as though he was trying to figure out what to do next. Slowly, he blinked and turned his gaze to his mother, his face pale. "What does she want from me, Mom?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Sarah felt a pang in her chest. The boy who once had so much curiosity, so much life in his eyes, was now reduced to this, lost in a sea of confusion and uncertainty. She reached out to place a hand on his shoulder, but her touch seemed to do little to calm the storm inside him. The accident had taken so much from him, and it hurt her more than she could ever express. She could never fix this for him. She could never make him whole again. Michael, standing slightly off to the side, crossed his arms and watched the dog with a skeptical frown. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he didn't like it. The sudden appearance of the dog, the way it was acting, something about it felt off. He wanted to tell Sarah that it was just a dog, that they shouldn't overthink this. But the look in Maggie's eyes stopped him. It wasn't normal, and that left him feeling unsettled. "Stay away from him," Michael muttered, stepping forward, his hands raised to ward off the dog. "He doesn't need this." But Maggie didn't move. She didn't flinch at Michael's words, nor did she back down. Instead, she took a slow step closer to Ethan, her eyes fixed firmly on his. There was something almost human in the way she held his gaze, as if trying to communicate something that transcended language. She wasn't barking out of aggression. There was no malice in her actions. No, it was as if she was trying to reach Ethan, to draw him out of the fog he had been living in since the accident. Ethan's body trembled slightly, his grip tightening around the armrests of his wheelchair. His eyes flicked nervously from the dog to his parents, his heart racing in his chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, something inside him stirred, a feeling of connection, an inexplicable pull toward this strange creature. His fingers twitched at his sides as he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "She wants me to touch her, doesn't she?" Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. Her son, the boy she had tried so hard to protect, was finally reaching out. But what did it mean? Why was Maggie so intent on him? And more importantly, what would happen if he gave in to whatever this strange pull was? She opened her mouth to say something, but the words caught in her throat. For a moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance. Time itself seemed to pause as Ethan hesitated, his hand hovering in the air, inches from Maggie's head. The golden retriever didn't make a sound. She simply stood there, her gaze never wavering, as if waiting for him to make the next move. And then, just as Ethan's trembling fingers were about to make contact with the dog's fur, something shifted. The tension in the air deepened, and a chill ran down Sarah's spine. Maggie let out a soft whimper, a sound so heartbreaking, so filled with yearning, that it felt as though the dog was pleading for something, a piece of herself, a part of the puzzle that she knew, but no one else did. Ethan's hand dropped back to his lap, and he recoiled slightly, as though he had been jolted by the sound. "I don't know what's going on," he whispered, his voice thick with confusion and fear. "But I feel like I'm supposed to do something." Maggie stood still for a moment longer, her eyes still fixed on Ethan, and then, as if she had made up her mind, she turned on her heels and began walking away. Her pace was deliberate, purposeful. She glanced back at Ethan once, as if making sure he was still following, and then continued on, her tail held high, her movements smooth and confident. Sarah and Michael exchanged uncertain looks, their hearts heavy with worry. Michael opened his mouth to protest, to say that they should stay here, that they should leave the dog behind, but something about the way Maggie moved silenced him. It was as though the dog knew something they didn't, something important. Ethan looked up at his parents, his eyes filled with an emotion they couldn't quite place. He had seen it too, the determination in Maggie's eyes, the urgency in her steps. He could no longer ignore it. "I need to follow her," he said, his voice steady but filled with an unspoken fear. "She's trying to show me something." Ethan's gaze lingered on Maggie as she walked away, her golden fur glistening in the fading sunlight. For a moment, everything felt uncertain, like the air had thickened with the weight of something unspoken. The park around them, once full of laughter and carefree chatter, seemed distant, as if it belonged to a world that no longer made sense. Ethan felt that pull in his chest again, stronger now, compelling him to follow the dog. But the strange feeling was accompanied by a knot of fear in his stomach. What if it was all a mistake? What if the dog was just being, well, a dog? Maybe he was reading too much into it. But Maggie's actions didn't feel like that. There was something urgent in the way she moved, something more than just an animal's instinct. And that's why, without saying another word, Ethan took the first tentative push of his wheelchair. Sarah and Michael watched as their son slowly wheeled himself forward, his eyes locked onto the dog. There was something so raw in Ethan's expression, an emotion neither of them could quite place. He wasn't asking for their permission, nor was he waiting for their approval. He simply moved, guided by something neither parent could understand, and that left them both feeling uneasy. "Ethan," Sarah called softly, her voice carrying a mixture of worry and disbelief. "Wait." But Ethan didn't stop. His eyes remained focused on Maggie, who now stood a little further away, just on the edge of the playground, looking back at him with a gaze that seemed to beckon him. The world around them seemed to narrow in on that single moment. The rustling leaves, the distant laughter, even the sun itself seemed to hang in the balance, waiting to see what would happen next. Michael stepped forward, his instincts kicking in. "Sarah, we should stop him. We don't even know where she's leading him." But Sarah didn't respond right away. She simply watched her son, a deep concern etched into her features. Ethan had been closed off for so long, ever since the accident. He barely spoke about it, never really acknowledged what had happened to him. It was like he had given up on everything, even on himself. Seeing him move now, with such determination, made Sarah's heart ache. She couldn't stop him. Not now. Not when it seemed like this was the first time in months that he was truly engaged with the world. "I can't," she whispered, barely able to breathe. "He needs to do this, Michael." Michael hesitated, torn between his protective instincts and the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. "But this isn't normal, Sarah. Dogs don't behave like this. Maggie's acting like she's trying to lead him somewhere. It's not just a walk." "I know," Sarah replied softly, her eyes never leaving Ethan's back. "But what if this is the moment he's been waiting for? The moment he can finally move on from everything?" But as the distance between Ethan and his parents grew, Sarah felt a tightening in her chest. The closer he got to Maggie, the more she felt something shifting in the air, a strange tension, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Ethan reached the edge of the playground, where the grass gave way to a small dirt path that led deeper into the park. Maggie had already started down the path, her golden form vanishing into the trees. Ethan hesitated for just a second, a flicker of doubt passing through his mind. Should he turn back? Was he truly ready for whatever lay ahead? But then, Maggie turned back to look at him once more, her eyes intense and knowing, as though telling him that this was no time for hesitation. Taking a deep breath, Ethan pushed his chair forward. The wheels rolled easily over the dirt path, and he felt a sense of motion that, for the first time in a long time, felt purposeful. Each turn of the wheels brought him closer to something unknown yet inevitable. But the path was not as smooth as it had seemed from a distance. The uneven ground, the growing shadows beneath the trees, and the thickening brush created obstacles for Ethan. He had been in a wheelchair long enough to know that the smallest bump could throw him off balance. As he made his way forward, his wheelchair lurched over a rock, sending a jolt through his body. Ethan gritted his teeth, trying to regain control, but his hands were slick with sweat from both the effort and the growing anxiety that bubbled within him. He wanted to push through it, but doubt began to creep in again. Was he even capable of this? What if something went wrong? What if this was all just some foolish idea, a wild chase after a dog who didn't even know what she was doing? Maggie, Ethan called out, his voice louder now, a sense of panic rising in his chest. Where are you taking me? Maggie's response was to glance over her shoulder, just once, before continuing forward, her pace steady and deliberate. It was as though she hadn't even heard him, or perhaps, as though she knew something that he didn't, something he wasn't ready to understand yet. Sarah and Michael were still behind him, their presence just beyond the tree line, a whisper of comfort in the background. They hadn't caught up yet, but it didn't matter. Ethan was no longer thinking about them. His focus was entirely on the dog and the path ahead. The deeper they went into the park, the darker it became. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining like fingers gripping the sky. The path narrowed, and Ethan had to concentrate harder now to avoid the obstacles that seemed to pop up at every turn. A branch reached down low, scraping against his wheelchair, but he pushed through it. His breath came faster, and the sound of his wheels against the dirt seemed to echo in the silence of the woods. Suddenly, Maggie stopped. She stood perfectly still, facing a large, twisted oak tree. The air seemed to grow colder, the wind picking up slightly as though nature itself was reacting to the dog's presence. Ethan wheeled himself closer, his heart pounding in his chest. There, at the base of the oak tree, something was half buried beneath a pile of fallen leaves and dirt. Maggie dug at it with urgency, her paws frantic, like she was searching for something important, something buried long ago. "Mom, Dad," Ethan called, his voice trembling, unsure if he should continue or turn back. The suspense was unbearable, and as much as he wanted to know what Maggie had found, a deep fear lodged itself in his throat. Sarah and Michael rushed forward, their faces filled with concern, but they said nothing. They could feel the weight of the moment, the significance of what might lie ahead. But when Maggie unearthed the object, none of them were prepared for what they would find. Ethan's heart raced as Maggie's paws scraped against the dirt, digging furiously at something hidden beneath the leaves and soil. The way she was acting, so determined, so frantic, left him feeling both excited and afraid. Was this the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when something in his life finally made sense again? Or was this another wild goose chase, leading him deeper into the unknown? He wasn't sure anymore. The air around him felt thick with anticipation, and every minute that passed made his chest tighten with unease. Sarah and Michael had caught up by now, standing just behind Ethan, their eyes scanning the ground where Maggie was digging. Their concern for their son was palpable, but they were also caught in the strange pull of the moment. Something about the dog's behavior was just wrong. It wasn't just a dog acting out of excitement or playfulness. No, Maggie seemed to have a singular purpose, and that purpose was leading Ethan towards something. But what was it? "Ethan, be careful," Sarah said, her voice strained with anxiety as she stepped closer to him. Her eyes shifted nervously from the dog to the ground, and then back to her son. The woods had taken on an eerie stillness, as if holding its breath, and the shadows seemed to press in from every side. It felt as though the forest itself was conspiring against them, keeping them from finding out whatever Maggie was so intent on showing them. Ethan didn't respond. His mind was too focused on the sight before him. The ground was soft where Maggie had been digging, the loose earth giving way to something solid. The dog's actions were frenzied now, almost desperate, as if she knew they were on the verge of discovering something vital. "Mom, Dad, look at this," Ethan murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He slowly wheeled himself closer, leaning forward in his chair, his hands trembling with both fear and anticipation. "What is this?" Maggie stopped suddenly, stepping back from the hole she had created. She looked at Ethan for a brief moment, her eyes filled with what almost seemed like approval, and then turned her gaze back to the hole as if to say, "It's time." With a deep breath, Ethan reached forward, his fingers brushing against the dirt as he carefully began to pull away the remaining soil. His hands were shaking so badly that he could hardly feel the ground beneath them, but he pressed on. Some deep, unspoken part of him, was telling him that this was important, that this moment could change everything. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Ethan unearthed an object. His heart skipped a beat as he pulled it out, holding it up for the others to see. It was a small wooden box, old and weathered, its edges worn with time. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he turned it over in his hands. There was something about this box that felt familiar, like he had seen it before, or at least had some deep connection to it. But the memories eluded him, fading like mist in the early morning light. "Where did this come from?" Michael asked, his voice low and filled with disbelief. He took a step forward, his brow furrowed with concern. "Ethan, what is this?" I don't know," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "But it feels like it's for me." Sarah's hand went to her mouth as she gasped, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and worry. "What do you mean?" "For you," she asked, stepping closer. "What's inside the box, Ethan?" Ethan's hands shook as he slowly pried open the lid of the box. The hinges creaked loudly in the silence of the forest, and the smell of damp wood filled the air. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a small, tarnished locket. Ethan picked it up carefully, his fingers trembling as he turned it over in his hands. The locket was engraved with a simple inscription, "For the one who will come after." Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he read the words over and over again, trying to make sense of them. But nothing made sense. Who was this for? Why did it feel like it had been waiting for him? Just then, a sound cut through the silence, loud, unexpected, and completely out of place. Michael jumped, his hand instinctively reaching for Sarah as they both turned toward the noise. The snap of a twig. Someone was there. Someone had been watching them. "Who's there?" Michael called out, his voice rising in panic. He stepped in front of Sarah, positioning himself between her and Ethan as if he could protect them from whatever was lurking in the trees. Sarah's heart raced. "Michael, what is this? What's going on?" Before Michael could answer, Maggie let out a low growl, her body tense as she stood between them and the dark woods. She seemed to be watching something in the distance, her eyes focused, unblinking. The dog's behavior was unlike anything they had ever seen. She wasn't just an animal reacting out of instinct. Maggie was aware. Maggie knew something. And then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a man, tall and thin, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. He stepped slowly toward them, his movements deliberate, his eyes focused entirely on Ethan. "Who are you?" Michael demanded, his voice sharp with the instinct to protect. "What do you want?" The man didn't speak immediately. Instead, he watched them all, his gaze flicking from Ethan to the locket in his hands. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old, yellowed letter. "This is for you," he said, his voice low, carrying an unsettling weight. He handed the letter to Ethan, who hesitated for a moment before taking it. It was sealed with a strange wax emblem, one that Ethan couldn't place. He held it in his hands, feeling the weight of it, as though this letter had been waiting for him just as the locket had. "Who are you?" Sarah repeated, her voice trembling now with a mix of fear and confusion. The man's lips twisted into a faint smile. You've been looking for answers, and now you have them. Ethan looked at the letter in his hands, his fingers trembling as he broke the seal. The contents of the letter, whatever they were, would change everything. The man's presence, his appearance, everything about him felt connected to something deep, something hidden in Ethan's past. But what was the truth? What was the story that had been kept from him all these years? As Ethan unfolded the letter, the cold, hard reality began to set in. The stakes were higher than he ever imagined. And as the man stood there, watching them with knowing eyes, Ethan realized that this wasn't just about a dog in a box. This was a truth that could shatter everything he thought he knew about himself, his family, and the past he had long tried to forget. Ethan held the letter in his hands, the edges crinkling slightly as his fingers gripped it tighter. The wax seal was old, fragile, and bore an unfamiliar symbol, an emblem that made his stomach churn with a strange sense of recognition, as if he had seen it before, though he couldn't place where. The man standing before them, silent and still, waited patiently, his eyes never leaving Ethan. Michael stepped forward, his protective instincts kicking into overdrive. "Who are you?" he demanded again, his voice shaking with a combination of anger and fear. "What's all this? What's in that letter?" The man simply nodded toward the letter in Ethan's hands, his lips curling into a tight smile. "You'll find the answers there, the truth you've been searching for." Ethan's heart raced. He glanced at his parents, their faces a mixture of confusion and growing dread. They didn't know who this man was, and the tension in the air was becoming suffocating. Every instinct in Ethan told him that this was it, the moment everything was about to change. But was he ready for it? Was he prepared to confront the reality of what lay before him? With shaking hands, Ethan tore open the letter. His breath caught in his throat as he read the words aloud, his voice cracking. "To my son, Ethan, if you are reading this, then you've found your way to Maggie. You have been led here for a reason. I am the one who gave you life, but I was not the one to raise you. I couldn't be. Life had other plans for me. But Maggie, she is the key. She has been with you since the beginning, though you never knew it. There is so much I wish I could have shared with you, but I can't. The world is full of secrets, and some must stay hidden. But now, it is time for you to know the truth about who you really are, where you came from, and why you've always felt like something was missing. I left you once, but I was never far away. My name is Thomas, and I am your biological father." Ethan's voice faltered as the final words hit him like a hammer. His mind whirled, trying to process the weight of the revelation. His biological father, the man whose name he had never known, was the one who had left him a legacy of unanswered questions. The truth about his life, the secret buried for years, was now in his hands. And yet, it felt like a heavy burden. Maggie, ever loyal, stepped closer, sitting down beside Ethan. She nudged her head against his leg, as if offering comfort, but it wasn't enough to erase the overwhelming confusion and pain swirling inside him. Ethan's eyes blurred with tears. "I don't understand," he whispered. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you come back?" The man in front of them stepped forward, his gaze softening for the first time. "Thomas didn't want to leave. He tried to come back to you. But circumstances," he trailed off, his voice cracking. "There was nothing he could do. But he never stopped thinking about you, Ethan. Maggie knew that. That's why she's here." Ethan's heart tightened in his chest. The dog, the golden retriever who had led him here, had been a part of this secret all along. But why? What was Maggie's role in all of this? Why had she been brought into his life at all? Suddenly, everything seemed to click. The locket, the letter, Maggie's strange behavior, all of it was connected, like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting for him to put them together. But the weight of the truth was almost too much to bear. His father had been alive all these years, had known about him, but had never been a part of his life. And the dog, the one who had barked at him and led him to this moment, she had known everything. She had been the bridge to a past he had never known existed. As Ethan sat there, surrounded by his parents and the man who claimed to be his biological father, the air grew thick with tension. His life, his identity, was being rewritten in front of his eyes, and he wasn't sure if he could handle it. "I don't know if I can do this," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "How do I move forward after everything I've learned?" Michael, who had been standing silently, his hand clenched into a fist, finally spoke. "You don't have to do this alone, Ethan. You have us. We may not be your biological family, but you're our son, and we love you. That doesn't change." Ethan looked up at his parents, seeing the truth in their eyes. His heart ached with gratitude, but also with the sting of loss. He had always wanted answers, but now that they were here, it felt like they came with a price. His biological father, the man who had abandoned him, had died before he could ever know him. And Maggie had been his silent guide all along. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt as if the pieces were falling into place. But the picture that emerged wasn't one of complete clarity. It was messy, filled with pain, but also with a sense of purpose. This was the beginning of something new, something he had to face head-on, no matter how hard it was. "Maybe it's time to let go of the past," Ethan whispered, his voice steadying, "and move forward." As Maggie sat by his side, her gentle presence grounding him, Ethan realized that this was just the beginning of his journey. The truth was out, and now it was up to him to decide what came next. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that he wasn't alone. Not anymore. The sun had set long ago, and the park was now shrouded in shadows, the faint light of the moon offering the only illumination as it filtered through the trees. The chill of the evening air seemed to match the heavy silence that had settled over the small group. Ethan held the letter in his hands, the words still echoing in his mind, but the weight of them was now sinking deeper into his chest. Maggie sat by his side, her head gently resting on his lap, sensing the storm of emotion swirling within him. He had always felt like something was missing, like there was a gap in his life that no amount of love from Sarah and Michael could fill. But now, the truth was out in the open. His biological father, Thomas, had been a part of his life in ways he could never have imagined. And yet, he had been absent in the most painful of ways. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest as he processed everything. His father had died before he had ever known him. Maggie, the dog who had guided him to this moment, had been a silent witness to all the lost years. What did it mean? What was he supposed to do with this knowledge? Why didn't he come back? Ethan asked, his voice breaking the silence. His words were soft, laced with the hurt of a boy who had longed for something he could never have. Why didn't he come back for me? The man, Thomas's friend, the one who had delivered the letter, shifted uncomfortably, as if unsure how to respond. He had been watching Ethan with a mix of sadness and pity, as though he understood the depth of the boy's pain, but had no easy answers to offer. I don't know if he could have, the man said quietly, his eyes darkening. Your father had his own demons. He tried, Ethan. He did. But life, circumstances, they kept him away. Michael stepped forward, his face tight with concern. The tension between them all felt unbearable, like the air itself was too thick to breathe. Enough with the cryptic answers, he said, his voice rising, frustrated. Just tell us what happened. Why wasn't he here? Why did he leave? The man's expression softened, but his eyes remained distant, haunted. Thomas didn't choose to leave you, Michael. He couldn't control the forces that separated him from you. He didn't know how to handle the responsibility of being a father. He thought he had time to change, to come back. But then the accident happened. Ethan felt a chill spread through his body at the mention of the accident. His eyes narrowed, piecing the broken pieces of the story together. He knew instinctively that something far deeper, far darker, had transpired in the past. Something that had torn apart the life that could have been. He needed to know the truth. He had to understand. Accident, Ethan repeated, his voice raw with emotion. What happened to him? The man sighed heavily, as though he had carried this burden for far too long. Thomas died in a car crash years ago. A mistake he made, one that he could never undo. He never got the chance to meet you, to tell you how much he loved you, Ethan. But he always knew you existed, and that's why he left Maggie with you. He wanted you to have something that connected you to him. He wanted her to help you find the answers when the time was right. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him, like a blow to the chest. His father had died so young. He had never had the chance to reconcile, to fix the past. And Maggie, the dog who had always been by his side, had been a silent messenger all along. Ethan's thoughts raced, struggling to come to terms with everything he had just learned. But just as he began to process the depth of his father's absence, a sharp sound pierced the stillness. Something out of place, something dangerous. A crack, followed by a thud. Before anyone could react, the rustling of leaves grew louder, and suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. A man, cloaked in dark, tattered clothes, stepped forward with purposeful strides. His face was obscured by a mask of dirt and shadows, his eyes wild with desperation. "Stay away from him," Michael shouted, instinctively moving between Ethan and the new threat, his body tense and ready for action. The man didn't listen. He came closer, his breath ragged, eyes locked onto Ethan, his movements frantic as though something deep inside him had snapped. Ethan's pulse quickened. "Who are you?" he asked, fear creeping into his voice. Maggie, sensing the danger, growled low and deep, standing between Ethan and the stranger, her fur bristling. But the man said nothing. He reached into his coat and pulled out a crumpled photo, a photo that Ethan could barely make out in the dim light. The photo was old, yellowing at the edges. "Your father, he was my brother." The man finally spoke, his voice rough, filled with anger and sadness. "I've been trying to find you, to tell you the truth. But now it's too late." Ethan's heart stopped. "What do you mean, too late?" The man's eyes grew darker, his grip tightening around the photo. "I've been following the trail. Maggie's trail. She led me here. She led me to you." Ethan's head spun. His biological father had family? A brother who had been looking for him all these years. And Maggie, she had known all along. The pieces were starting to fall together in ways Ethan couldn't fully comprehend. Maggie had been the key. But why hadn't she just told him the truth from the start? What was the real connection between his father, this man, and the past that had been kept hidden for so long? Tension thickened in the air as the stranger took another step forward, holding out the photo with trembling hands. "You deserve to know, Ethan. Everything. About your father, your family, and about the mistake I made." Ethan's mind reeled. The story was far from over, and the truth that had been kept from him was darker and more complicated than he ever imagined. The stranger's face remained obscured by the mask of shadows, his presence unsettling as he stood in front of Ethan, gripping the crumpled photo tightly in his hands. Maggie's low growl filled the air, the tension between the group palpable, her protective instincts fully awakened. "Who are you?" Michael's voice was sharp, demanding an answer. His protective stance remained, but his body was tense, his hands clenched into fists as if ready to defend his family at all costs. The man's eyes were wild, flickering between Ethan and the photo in his hands. He didn't respond immediately, as if the weight of the moment was pressing down on him. His ragged breathing filled the silence, and then, with trembling hands, he extended the photograph to Ethan. "I'm Thomas's brother," he said finally, his voice hoarse, as though the words had been stuck in his throat for years. "I'm your uncle." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His uncle? He had no idea his father even had family, let alone someone who had been searching for him all these years. Maggie, the dog who had been by his side for as long as he could remember, seemed to recognize the man, her growling subsiding, replaced by a quiet, almost mournful whimper, as if she knew this moment was the culmination of everything they had all been unknowingly leading up to. "Why now?" Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why didn't you come sooner?" The stranger's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, Ethan saw the pain in his eyes. "I couldn't. I was running from my past, just like Thomas was. And when I heard about him, when I found out what happened, how he died, I realized I had lost my chance to tell you, to be there for you." His voice faltered, the raw emotion spilling out. "I couldn't be the man I should have been. But Maggie," he glanced down at the dog, who had now silently moved closer to Ethan. "She's the one who's been guiding me. She knew it was time for me to find you." Ethan's thoughts swirled, and he could barely keep up with the onslaught of information. His uncle, this man, had been following the trail Maggie had left, the trail of grief and unanswered questions that had defined his life for so long. Maggie had been more than just a companion. She had been the link to this hidden part of his family. And now, in front of him, was the man who shared his blood, his father's brother. The full weight of the situation settled over him like a cloud, suffocating in its heaviness. He had always wondered why he never knew the full story of his father, why Thomas had never been a part of his life. Now, it seemed, the truth was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. "Why didn't Maggie just tell me the truth sooner?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with confusion and hurt. Why did she wait? The stranger's eyes softened, and he took a step closer. "Maggie couldn't tell you everything, Ethan. She couldn't give you the answers. But she was always meant to bring you here, to this moment, when you were ready to know the truth." Ethan looked down at the dog, her amber eyes meeting his with a kind of quiet understanding. Maggie had known all along, and now she was here, still by his side, still guiding him. He realized, in that moment, that Maggie had been a constant presence in his life, not just as a companion, but as a silent protector. She had been the link between him and a past that had been hidden for so long. "You've got a family," the stranger said, his voice breaking through Ethan's thoughts. "And we may not be perfect, but we're here for you now. We're here to help you understand everything. Your father, what happened and why." Ethan felt a surge of emotion rise in his chest. His life, everything he thought he knew about himself, was shifting. But the anger, the confusion, the hurt that had been building up over the years was slowly starting to melt away. He wasn't alone anymore. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long while, he could see a way forward. Looking up at his parents, he saw the uncertainty in their eyes, the worry for him, but also the unconditional love they had always given him. Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "Ethan," she said softly, "whatever the truth is, we're your family too. We love you, and we always will." The knot in his chest loosened as he finally spoke. "I know, Mom. I know." For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt a sense of peace, an acceptance of the truths that had been hidden for so long. The dog who had barked at him in the park, the man who had been lost to him for years, the family who had been waiting in the shadows, they were all here now, in this moment, ready to heal the wounds that had been carried for so long. And as Maggie sat beside him, her presence more comforting than he had ever realized, Ethan finally understood. The truth wasn't just about finding out who his father had been. It was about learning to live with the pieces of his past and embracing the family that had always been there, waiting to help him put everything back together. The night air had grown cooler, and the quiet was almost deafening as Ethan, his parents, the stranger, his uncle, and Maggie stood together in the shadows of the forest. The weight of everything that had been revealed pressed heavily on Ethan's shoulders. His life had shifted in ways he couldn't have predicted, and yet, in this moment, there was a sense of peace settling over him, a strange but welcome quiet after the storm of revelations. Ethan glanced down at Maggie, who sat at his feet, her head resting gently against his leg. Her presence was soothing, grounding him in the midst of everything that had happened. She had been the key to all of this, leading him to the truth, guiding him through the fog of unanswered questions. For the first time in a long while, he felt as if the pieces were falling into place. His uncle, still standing by, watched him with a mix of hope and regret in his eyes. "Ethan," he said softly, stepping closer, "I know this isn't easy to process. I know there's a lot you've had to come to terms with, but I want you to know that I'm here for you, and we'll take it one step at a time, together." Ethan nodded, though his mind was racing. The knowledge of his father's absence, the loss of the man who should have been a part of his life, still stung. But there was a sense of clarity, too, like a fog had lifted. The anger he had carried for so long, the questions that had gnawed at him, those feelings were slowly starting to fade, replaced by a sense of understanding. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly, his voice steady now, despite the overwhelming emotions swirling inside him. He looked up at his parents, who had been standing nearby. silently watching the exchange. Sarah stepped forward first, her eyes filled with warmth and something deeper, grief, perhaps, but also hope. She placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We're here, Ethan. We've always been here. We love you, and nothing changes that. You don't have to face any of this alone." Michael, who had remained silent up until now, stepped closer, his hand resting on Sarah's back. His expression was more guarded, as though he were still processing everything that had unfolded. But when he spoke, there was a quiet strength in his voice. "Your mother's right. We're your family, Ethan. We're not perfect, but we've always been here for you, and that won't change." Ethan looked at his parents, his heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and sadness. They had given him everything they could, even when he hadn't been able to accept it, even when he had pushed them away in his own quiet battle. They had loved him unconditionally, and that was something he would never be able to repay, but it was something he could learn to accept. "I know," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know, and I'm sorry. I've been so lost, so angry for so long. I didn't know how to handle any of it. But now I do." He looked back at his uncle, who was watching him closely. "And I'm ready to try, to be part of this family, to let go of what I've been holding on to." His uncle nodded, his eyes glistening with emotion. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for. This is a lot, Ethan, and we'll take it at your pace. But just know that you're not alone anymore. You have people who want to be there for you, people who care." Ethan took a deep breath, the weight of everything still heavy, but the first sense of relief starting to seep through. For so long, he had carried the weight of his father's absence alone. Now there was a new reality taking shape, reality where he wasn't alone anymore, where he could start to rebuild, start to understand who he was and where he came from. The night grew quieter as the moments stretched on. Ethan's parents, still close by, gave him space, but were always present, always supporting him. His uncle remained, offering a quiet but steady presence as well, his eyes never leaving Ethan. Maggie, for her part, remained calm, her head resting on Ethan's lap, as though she understood that the hardest part was over. There was no more running from the truth, no more unanswered questions. The pieces had fallen into place, and now it was time to start the work of healing. "I don't know what's next," Ethan said softly, breaking the silence, his voice filled with a quiet strength. "But I want to find out. I want to learn about my dad, about my family, and I want to do it without the anger, without the fear. I want to move forward." Sarah smiled softly, her hand still on Ethan's shoulder. "That's all we can ask for, sweetheart. Just take it one step at a time. We're here for you." The resolution was slow, and it wasn't without its struggles, but the foundation had been laid. Ethan no longer had to carry the weight of his past alone. He had his family. He had Maggie. And for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope, a hope that he could start to move forward, one step at a time, into a future that was still unknown but no longer so terrifying. As the night unfolded, the heaviness that had weighed on Ethan's heart for so long seemed to lift, if only slightly. The air, once thick with confusion and anger, now felt lighter. The full moon shone overhead, casting a soft glow on the small clearing where they stood. The woods around them, once dark and ominous, now felt like a quiet witness to the beginnings of something new, a beginning Ethan had never anticipated but was starting to accept. He sat quietly, his wheelchair settled in the soft grass beneath him. Maggie, the dog who had led him through every twist and turn of the journey, rested at his feet. Her golden fur blended with the moonlight, and as she looked up at him, Ethan saw only calm, understanding, and the reassurance that she had been with him every step of the way. His uncle, who had introduced himself as Thomas's brother, sat a few feet away, still processing the weight of everything. He had shared a story so full of sorrow and regret, but also one of love. He had been lost in his own battles, just as Thomas had, but the truth was clear now. He had found Ethan, and despite the years that had been lost, there was a sense of redemption in the air, both for him and for Ethan. The silence between them was comfortable now, not as heavy as before. Sarah and Michael stood beside Ethan, their hands intertwined, their presence a steady reminder of the family he had always known. They had been with him through everything, the accidents, the pain, the moments of loneliness. And now, they stood together, ready to walk alongside him into whatever came next. "I never thought I'd be sitting here, with all of you," Ethan said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but there was a weight to it that hinted at the journey he had just begun. "I never thought I'd get to know the truth about my dad, or even about why everything happened the way it did. It feels like a lifetime of questions, and now, it's like those questions don't matter so much anymore. What matters is what happens from here." Sarah's hand squeezed his shoulder. "What matters is that you're not alone anymore. And whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Ethan smiled, a small but genuine smile, as the truth of her words settled in. It had taken him so long to accept the love and support that had always been right in front of him. He had lived so long in the shadow of unanswered questions, of pain, and of anger. But now, with his family by his side, he could see a future where he could finally begin to heal. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes moving from Sarah to Michael, and then to his uncle. "Thank you for being here, for being my family." His uncle nodded, a smile breaking through his own tired expression. "You're welcome, Ethan. You've got more family than you know. And Maggie," he glanced at the dog, who had now shifted to rest her head on Ethan's lap, as if guarding him one last time. "She's been with you through it all. She knew when the time was right." Ethan looked down at Maggie, his heart full of gratitude. The dog had been more than just a pet, more than just an animal. She had been the silent messenger, the guide, and in many ways, the catalyst for change. He realized now that everything she had done, her strange behavior, her barking, her unwavering loyalty, had been leading him to this moment, to the truth. Maggie lifted her head slightly, meeting Ethan's gaze with eyes full of understanding, as if to say, "It's time." The truth had come in waves, each revelation harder than the last, but each one had brought him closer to understanding, to forgiveness, and to peace. He didn't have all the answers, but he was learning to let go of the anger, the fear, and the sadness that had held him captive for so long. There was no perfect resolution, no ideal ending, but the journey toward healing had begun. As the night deepened, the small group began to make their way back home. The stars above, clearer now, reflected the quiet sense of resolution Ethan felt within himself. He wasn't the same boy who had first sat in the park, lost in his own grief and confusion. He was someone new, someone who had faced the truth, embraced the past, and was ready to build the future. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something he hadn't thought possible, hope. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but with Maggie at his side, and his family around him, he knew he wasn't walking through it alone.